Okay, I'm going to get us started. Hi, everyone. My name is Angela Giacchetti. I lead engagement and communications for the Open Mobility Foundation. Thanks so much to everyone who's joining us today. I'm really excited about this curb policy webinar that we have for you. I'm going to start us out with just a brief introduction of the topic and who you're going to hear from today, as well as some housekeeping, and then we're going to dive into the meat of the conversation. But really, what just at a very high level, what inspired us to do this and do this work and all of our kind of curb policy work of the moment is really our Smart Curb Collaborative. So I know many of you on the line today represent the 10 cities that are part of the Open Mobility Foundation's Smart Curb Collaborative. This is a group of 10 cities in the United States who have received funding from USDOT to pilot curb management programs that all incorporate the use of the curb data specification, which is the data standard that we steward that allows cities to represent their curb policies digitally, as well as collect information about what's happening at the curb and synthesize that into metrics. So I'm going to start us out with some housekeeping. Just a couple of things we want everyone to be able to kind of participate throughout this webinar. So these are just a couple of tips. First, please set your name and organization in the participant list. We'd love to know what company, city, organization you're with, so that we can kind of better understand where the questions are coming from. Then also feel free to introduce yourself in chat. There will also be opportunities to kind of share your personal experiences or your specific code provisions, which we'll get to a little bit later during the presentation. Feel free to use the Q&A feature to ask questions throughout. Down at the bottom, you'll see there's a chat and a Q&A box. They're different boxes. For Q&A, we'll be able to answer kind of quick questions throughout the presentation portion, and then we'll have Q&A and more of a discussion at the end. And last, this webinar is being recorded, and we will publish it on OMF's YouTube channel, which is also where you can find all of our previous webinars, including another webinar that we had about kind of the big picture of curb policy. So more of a conversation about the high level objectives that cities can reach with better curb management and better curb policies. So that's it for the housekeeping. Today's agenda, pretty brief. We're going to get right into it. I'm just going to set us up with some introductions. Then we're going to get into a presentation on modernizing curb policy. And then we'll go into Q&A. And really, this webinar is a complement to a resource paper that we have out today about curb policy modernization. And so today we're really going to be talking about how do you use that paper? How do you use these resources to create more modern, effective curb policies? So just quickly, a little bit about the OMF for those of you who are new. I know I see a lot of familiar names and faces, but the OMF is a nonprofit organization that is designed and our mission is to create digital infrastructure that helps cities manage public space for the public good. So to reach public policy outcomes, create more livable cities. We do this by creating data standards and free and open source tools like the curb data specification that I just mentioned. You can learn more about the tools that we create on our website. And we are a public-private partnership. So we bring together cities and private sector companies to build things together, to create together. So if you want to get more involved in the OMF, I'm going to drop a link in the chat. And also several of our team members are here and available to answer any questions about the OMF and what we do. As I mentioned, we have the Smart Curb Collaborative as part of our work. And we work really closely with CityFi as a project partner for the collaborative. And CityFi is a consultancy that really has deep knowledge of cities and their challenges. And so they've been just an awesome partner filled with innovators, entrepreneurs, nonprofit leaders, urban planners to enhance this work that we've been doing. And today you're going to hear from two of CityFi's experts, Erin Clark, who's a principal at CityFi and works really closely with the Smart Curb Collaborative based out of Pittsburgh, an attorney by training, and also a policy expert. And then she's joined by Sarah Saltz, a senior associate at CityFi, CityFi's other kind of curb management resident expert, also a trained urban planner, and really whiz of all things curb management. So they put together this research paper, resource paper with insights from members of the Smart Curb Collaborative, and they're going to help bring this paper to life and show us how to use it to enhance city policy. So I'll hand it over.
Yeah. We can jump to the next slide. Thanks so much, Angela. And really excited to be here today. And thank you all for joining. I know we're competing with the first day of March Madness, so some of you may have dueling screens right now with a basketball game on, and we'll accept that. We really appreciate you taking time out of your day to join this webinar and hope you take something valuable away from it. We really wanted to kick off the conversation today with a little bit of level setting, though, on what we mean by policy. So policy can be a pretty broad term and have different meanings in different contexts. Some of you may have attended the Curb Management for Policymakers webinar last June. If you haven't, you should check it out. Maybe Emma or Angela can drop a link. That webinar really focused on public policy and sort of more of those societal outcomes that modern curb management can generate, which is really important to start with those public policy conversations, because those are ultimately the outcomes your city or community are seeking to achieve and really the foundation of your curb management work. Today, however, we're going to be talking about our authority to implement curb management strategies and programs. The focus today is really more on regulatory policy. So those are more of like the rules and ordinances that govern curb and right-of-way management and sort of how we design our streets and curbs in our city. So I know some of you just heard or are looking at words on the screen like rules and ordinances and are thinking maybe I should multitask during this or jump off this webinar, but please don't. You're already here, so don't leave. We're going to make this an engaging topic and conversation today. Hopefully give you some ideas on how to review your city's rules and ordinances in order to anticipate future barriers to carrying out your curb management plans. So we can jump to the next. So this is actually a slide from the Curb Management for Policymakers webinar last year, focusing on those societal and city outcomes that can result from more modern curb management. So I do just want to encourage everyone to think of these various OMF webinars as building off of each other and informing each other. Last year, we talked about some of the value adds of curb management, including emissions reduction, data-informed decision-making, more user-friendly designs, equity, allowing a systems approach to curb management. But again, today we're just going to sort of focus more on what needs to be in your code or formally adopted in policy to achieve these outcomes through curb management.
Erin, I think you went on mute.
Oh no, thanks. Sorry about that. I just was going to note, make sure the chat feature is working for everyone now as well, and just encourage folks to drop comments or resources or things into the chat as Sarah and I are presenting today. I just saw the comment that had come through that maybe it wasn't working for everyone.
Yeah, we're working on it.
All good. So I think we may have skipped the last slide. Yeah. So Angela already shouted out, but I think the group deserves a double shout out. I just wanted to take a minute to really acknowledge and thank the Smart Curb Collaborative, which are the 10 cities that you see represented on the screen. Um, this work was not created in a vacuum by consultants. It was informed by months of curb pilots, collaborative discussion, shared learnings. Many of the examples you'll see in the resource document that OMF released today are examples from the curb collaborative cities. Um, and so just a shout out to all the hard work that's gone into those cities. Thanks to the collaborative, especially for your willingness to inform resources like these that can serve other cities in advancing their curb management plans.
All right, so the resource document. This is what it looks like. And after the call, you will all have access to this curb modernization guidance resource document published by the OMF in coordination with CityFi, and as Aaron and Angela both said, informed by cities in the SMART Collaborative. And our purpose in bringing together all of these different pieces of guidance into one centralized place and creating this resource is really to provide a foundation for creating a regulatory policy framework, right, in your city, in specific cities, and start taking the steps to a more modern approach to curb management policy. I think all of us on this call know oftentimes municipal codes and city policies can become outdated and no longer reflect what is current or emerging in terms of curb management strategies that a city needs or will need, or the policy may no longer align with the city's priorities and goals today. We know this. And so with this guidance resource document, our hope is that cities can be more proactive in developing this kind of strategic curb regulation and policy, and really start thinking about it now a little bit more proactively. So if we go to the next slide, so the guidance, this is a little bit of a table of contents, like a preview of the document that you'll see, but it's organized into 4 topic areas here. And within each topic area, there are some specific recommendations for how to think about reviewing and modernizing like specific code provisions within each topic area. And as you read through this document, when you're reading through it, you'll note that your city, or for our industry folks or consulting folks here on this call, a city that you might be working with or want to work with, you might notice that it's already been modernized in some ways, right? You might notice that not all of these apply in every case, but there might be some areas, 1 or 2 specific areas that you haven't yet addressed or thought about. And so it's not really an all or nothing process, right? We encourage you to pick and choose what is most relevant. We know every city operates in a very nuanced and specific political context and operational context. And so this is not meant to be a one-size-fits-all approach, but rather a starting point, right? How can we prioritize what is most immediate in terms of what we want to modernize, what we want to review, and what do we want to put on our plan for longer term strategy. So we really hope that you use it in whatever way is best for you, and it helps with some of these topic areas. So because next slide, because the focus of this guidance is on city code, a lot of the guidance is focused and kind of iterated around city staff. So for our city staff, have you, if you've ever had a good idea and you bring it to leadership or city attorney folks and you're met with we can't do that, our code doesn't allow it, or I don't think we can do that, it's silent on it. If you don't know what your rules and laws say, you have to kind of just accept that no. But by using, we hope, by using the guidance in this document and really taking inventory of your code, you can be empowered to ask those questions, propose solutions, explore what changes you could take to get to yes, to get to a place where the code isn't silent on it, for example. It's also important, we think, for cities because having a very clear, modern, current regulatory framework generally makes you a more attractive market for new companies, for new curb management companies. And that helps, you can get, for example, more responses to a solicitation or an RFP. And then you are in the driver's seat as the city, right? You can compare and contrast companies. You are an attractive place to be because your code allows companies to operate. And so, like, we think that while cities are a primary audience of this, that being said, the idea of proactively looking at city code and identifying gaps, opportunities, this can be a really valuable strategy and a worthwhile undertaking for the private sector. We don't want this to just be a public sector city guidance document. And private sector, as you know, as you're thinking about which markets should you prioritize entering, right? Where is our near-term market entry priorities versus maybe longer-term or lower priorities? The city code will really help you make that decision and help you understand the level of effort it will require to enter a city. So understanding in these earlier stages what the regulatory environment is in the various markets you have on your plans can save you a lot of time and money in the long run. So we really encourage private sector folks to also use this document, use this guidance to review codes for priority cities. Okay, so I'll pause there, and we want to turn it over to you all and understand where do folks stand? Where do you sit in terms of your level of understanding for municipal codes? So Angela and Em, if we can launch our survey, we want to hear the range of where folks sit on this call in terms of having reviewed municipal code, or like, why would I do that? What is that? So I'll leave it to OMF to launch that. Okay, so it should have popped up in a separate window for everybody, and we'll give it a few minutes, starting with Nada and ending with you are the expert. You could be running this call. We'll give it a few minutes.
I think I don't think the right question came up. Maybe that I'm seeing a CDS question.
Yeah, I am too.
That is the one that was in there. Sorry about
Oh no.
that.
Tech issues
Well, now we
today.
know. Now we
Sorry,
know
everyone.
about CDS.
We can also just move on, Aaron, if you want to walk through some of the operations.
Yeah. As a spoiler, well, not a spoiler, but our question was just going to be, how familiar are you with your something to think about, and if we can share through the Q&A alternative chat option, just trying to get a sense of like how familiar you are with your specific, more particularly for city staff, with your municipal code. So like, have you ever looked at it? Have you sort of skimmed it? Have you tried to read it, but it's like too confusing, there's too many provisions? Or are you like Sarah and I, and you know it like the back of your hand and are just nerding out on ordinances all day? So if you're able to share, please do, but otherwise, just something to think about, sort of where you are now as we walk through this presentation. But we want to get into a little bit more of like, why does this matter? What obstacles does can outdated code present for modern curb management? So some examples here: it can restrict your ability to price the curb based on economic principles if it's written in an outdated way. It can also restrict your ability to lower time limitations on certain curb zones. We know today's demands at the curb are often those short pickups, drop-offs, shorter stays, not always the longer personal vehicle parks. It can prevent the use of technology to help manage the curb. And it can also limit where curb revenue can be reinvested. Often parking revenue is, dictated to go toward a certain revenue stream or revenue fund in a city. Whereas there's opportunities today, as we think about pricing the curb differently, to reinvest some of that money back into the communities. You can hop to the next slide. So moving on to the more tactical part of the webinar, what can you do and where should you start in modernizing curb policy? And to Sarah's point, most of you on the call have started, but this is intended to sort of give you some recommendations with revisiting your code and policies and sort of thinking through future potential obstacles and opportunities in a different way. So we really recommend you start with really getting to know your municipal code and other formal rules and policies. And this doesn't just mean, a passive like read or skim of your code. It means critically kind of reviewing and annotating and asking questions as you go. So some of the questions we'd encourage you to consider are, is there a methodology for allocating curb space? So some, but not all cities have started to adopt curb prioritization frameworks that have been adopted by council and can inform a more consistent methodology for allocating curb space. What type of activity is allowed at the curb? Who has authority to price the curb, especially where it isn't currently priced? Who can change curb rates and how? Who can set time restrictions at the curb and what is that process? Can technology be used to promote compliance at the curb? And is there a mechanism to test or pilot curb management approaches without going through like a formal council approval process or other legislative process? We can hop to the next slide. And one thing I think is really important to think about is what to look out for. Like, what are those red flags? One thing we really see often is silence in the law, which can really just lead to like ambiguity and uncertainty and leave particularly city attorneys, but even just leadership and staff reluctant to interpret the law in a favorable way that's going to advance like curb management work. And this isn't necessarily for any like ill-intentioned reason, but if you think about curb or just right-of-way code provisions that were written 20 or 30 years ago, those didn't even contemplate the complexity of the curb environment that we're experiencing today, nor the technologies available to help to manage the curb. So sometimes they're just silent because it wasn't even sort of in the realm of possible when the original drafters were writing those provisions. It's also important to look at outdated provisions that don't contemplate those new curb demands. And so sometimes we'll talk about some examples here later on, but there's just provisions that don't allow cities to do certain things because, again, similar to there being a silence in the law, that it just wasn't contemplated when the provision was written. So it's just really important to think about like the modern uses, what you want to do, what you have in your curb management plans, and ensuring that you are sort of legally authorized to do these new and innovative things at the curb. Really important is provisions that contradict each other. When drafting new or amending code, generally drafters are looking for those contradicting provisions, but sometimes things slip through the crack. And so it's just important as you're reading one section in this chapter, you're kind of keeping that in the back of your mind because there might be another provision in another chapter that contradicts that. And usually there's like a legal way to sort of interpret or to prioritize one provision over the other, but it just again leads to that sort of uncertainty and confusion. The more clarity there is in the laws that you're working with, the easier your job will be to execute your curb management plans. And then finally, curb management authority being granted to too many agencies, which can make modernization efforts difficult. So we've seen municipal codes that grant, general authority of managing the right of way to like a DOT or DPW. But then a finance department maybe has authority to set rates at the curb, and another department has enforcement authority, and then council has to sign off on X, Y, and Z decisions. And so it's just important to try to consolidate sort of that general authority for curb management, hopefully to one agency. Not in a way that's like giving unbridled power, but just in a way that allows a more comprehensive approach to curb management. And we're going to jump into some examples, and others on the call. Feel free to interrupt me if I'm missing any chatter in the Q&A or anything. But what we're going to do with these examples is just walk through some sort of what we would call like outdated provisions versus more modern provisions, just again to start generating some food for thought as you're reviewing your own code. I'll note all of these are sort of anonymized, or we've made them generic or pulled like certain language from various codes. We just didn't want to call out like the good or the bad today, but in the resource guidance document, we've cited and linked to real world city and state examples that you can point to. And so for today's purpose, to keep it a little more straightforward, we've anonymized, but that's not true of the actual resource document that you'll have access to. So starting with this meter rates example. So this is just an example of something we would consider a little more outdated, in that this municipal code sets hourly parking rates in code. So why is this outdated or a bit problematic? One, I mean, you can see the rates are fairly low, but this is referencing over a decade ago. But it also means that every time that you would want to update or amend, one, they're static, they're just like set rates. And anytime you would want to update these, you would have to go through the entire legislative process, not even just like less formal approval from council, but you would have to actually amend code, which is just really time consuming and lengthy. We're seeing a lot of cities now leading in more regularly updating their pricing and using economic principles to inform their curb pricing and basing that more on supply and demand. So we can hop to the next example, which is our more modern example. This just like gives space for that flexibility without, again, like there's, many political environments aren't going to allow a DOT or other managing agency to just have like totally unbridled power or discretion. But in this case, City Council passed an ordinance that authorized the DOT to set parking rates, but they set sort of a ceiling and a floor. So $1 minimum, $8 per hour maximum, with exemptions for higher rates for city center events. This allows sort of that discretion of the DOT to change rates without going through formal legislation up to at least that maximum hourly rate.
Okay. Time limits. Time limits are another way that cities are thinking about modernizing their codes and thinking about how they can, write code that responds to greater demands that, you all know that we're seeing at the curb. So time limits is a really effective way to do it, especially time limits coupled with like metering and charging. And so in this example, the code dictates that any metered parking has to have a minimum time limit of 2 hours. And so what this effectively does by having that in the code is it eliminates the ability for the city to charge or meter any stays shorter than 2 hours. And so you can tell, right, that this type of provision is something that was probably written in a different context than what we have today, right? When today we're really thinking about productivity and efficiency and making sure that all the different demands and uses of the curb can coexist. In this time, right, it was less of a need to encourage turnover, and the curb was much more of a static, longer term private vehicle parking. And so it's you can just tell that it was written during a different context. And if we go to the next example, on the kind of other hand, we can see that this code is written in a much broader way, a much more flexible way. So when it comes to time limits, and so here, right, the agency or the city traffic engineer, for example, has discretion to set the time limits as they see fit. The code doesn't dictate a minimum, number of hours for zones that have time limitations. So it really allows the city to respond to how need and demand is evolving at the curb. And it doesn't show it in this section, but later in the code, it allows you to charge for parking in the zones, right? But this kind of clip just shows how the writing is, there's no minimum. It's flexible and broad. So we can go to the next example.
Yeah, so if I've talked to you about curb management or the use of technology, you've probably heard me give this example. It's one of my favorites and maybe one of the most frustrating, as well as we're thinking about using technology to potentially supplement curb enforcement. And so many city codes, but I'll also flag that these types of provisions also exist often at the state level. And I know for purposes of today's discussion, like as a city staffer in particular, but even as an elected official, you don't have power to change state law, at least not super easily. But you should be also familiarizing yourself with state law provisions related to parking and curb management, and just being aware of any barriers that might exist at the state level. And that's just a good thing to flag for your leadership within your city to understand where like lobbying efforts might be needed. But anyway, back to this example. So often, in order to serve a parking citation or parking ticket, whether it's like been criminalized or decriminalized in your city, code is often written that the officer, so the parking enforcement officer or the law enforcement officer who is issuing the ticket has to deliver the citation to the driver, or if the vehicle is unattended, attach the citation to the vehicle in a conspicuous place. So both of these require like physical delivery, like handing the citation to the driver or affixing it to the vehicle in a conspicuous place. This, just by default, is most often interpreted to prohibit the use of automated enforcement. And so I know a lot of your cities, obviously at the state level, like you can they do a lot of tolling on state roads, but at the local level, we're seeing a lot more like red light camera enforcement, for instance. And cities are interested in using similar technology to try to catch those like quick violators in the really problematic areas, for instance. And often code amendments are going to be needed in order to enable the use of that type of technology, to issue tickets to the registered owner of the vehicle via mail, for instance. So we can go to like a more modern example. This is an example of a city who contemplated this and added a provision that kind of says like notwithstanding any other provision of our code. So maybe there is a reference to sort of this physical delivery of citations, but they say that notices of violations pursuant to a camera-based parking enforcement system may be served by mail upon the registered owner of the vehicle. So it just like gives clarity within the law that technology can be used. Camera-based parking enforcement systems can be used in the city, and there's just different ways of serving those types of violations.
Piloting. For those of you who know CityFi and us at CityFi, you know this is one of our favorite way to think about modernizing code when it comes to curb management. So we had to include an example and call it out specifically. So in this example, it's a little wordy, but basically the process for deploying a pilot is that City Council will review and approve the pilots on an individual basis, right? So for every pilot that any department wants to do, it will have to be adopted into city code. This, as you all know, can be a pretty drawn out, complex, lengthy process, both politically in terms of the amount of stakeholder engagement and just conversations you need to have and the buy-in that you need to generate leading in, and also legislatively with this more formal city council process. And so this type, this structure for piloting, right? It made sense when it was very one-off, right? Again, a different area, a different context. But now as cities are incorporating pilots as part of their way of starting programs, right? And testing new technologies, and it's becoming more and more commonplace. The idea of legislating individual pilot programs and having an entire process for each individual program, one, can deter innovation, right? You might, if it's a small project, right, or a small space or a short thing, and you're not sure if it's going to work or not, the idea of having to do the entire legislative process for this one small pilot will deter that innovation. It also like clutters your city code, right? If you can imagine, you've done a few pilots, every department's doing a few pilot, a pilot a year even, it just becomes unwieldy really quickly. And so we suggest moving away from this very like ad hoc, individual hands-on approach, and to, if you go to the next slide, of what a test, more what we would recommend, where in this example, right, the code gives the agency, whatever the agency is, some discretion to pilot. While it does this, it also provides, it's a very lengthy provision, this code, we just copied the first chunk, but it provides a pretty standardized, regularized process for ensuring that the pilot is planned and deployed in a transparent way, that there's evaluation, that city council is looped in. It's not a free-for-all, but it does give a structured framework for allowing an agency to pilot, assuming it meets these conditions and criteria. You don't need to go through a legislative process every time. What's in city code is the process that they will go through. And so this can be a really good enabler of innovation, and allowing cities to play and test new technologies. It encourages you to try new things. It's hard to really like have the space to innovate and improve and try things if you have to go through city council every time you want to do a small thing like this. So that's on the pilot side. If we go to the next slide.
Yeah.
I think this is our last example.
Yes, it is our last example. So this is actually a little bit more on like the design of the curb space and just being aware of wording that, again, may not have been intended to prohibit cities from designing the curb space in a certain way or designing the right of way in a certain way, but it does. So a lot of either local or often state provisions will reference on-street parking, and that it dictates that vehicles that are parked on street must be parallel to the curb, which makes sense, and within 12 inches of the right-hand curb or the edge of the roadway. And so these 12 inches was obviously originally anticipated, or intended rather, to ensure that cars aren't parking, 2 feet off the curb and impeding the travel lane. But what this does sort of in modern practice is that many cities are wanting to explore or install parking protected bike lanes. And if a parking lane has to be 12 inches from the curb, it essentially precludes the ability to put that bike lane between the curb and the parking lane. And so that one's a little more updated. And if we want to jump to outdated, sorry, if we want to jump to the next one, this is just an update of a code that sort of contemplates a parking protected bike lane. And so it references like when there is an on-street pedestrian plaza or a bike lane adjacent to the right-hand curb, that vehicles can park parallel to and within 12 inches of the outside buffer area between the pedestrian plaza or the bike lane and parking. And so, again, just, these are kind of small things that you may not notice at first glance or at first read, but when you're kind of getting to the technical application, some of these details really matter, and city attorneys or others may sort of shut down an idea or say that the law currently doesn't allow something due to the way these are written. So I think we are going to try to start to wrap up the presentation period with our original survey question, just to get a little bit of a sense. I think that's loaded now. And then we'll jump into a second question as well after we see these results, but we'll just give a few seconds for folks to answer. And you can just put yourself in the shoes of a city employee if you're joining from the private sector, kind of just pick the answer most applicable to you, whether you've sort of thought these things through or looked at it on a customer sort of basis as a private sector company. Good. I'm so pleasantly surprised to see I have a pretty good grasp on it from so many folks, and even some that know it like the back of their hand. But I know, it's no surprise and no shame for the folks that said that you've been meaning to read that, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of the like resource and empowerment and motivation maybe to read that sometime soon and do a little bit of analysis. So we're going to jump into one more survey question just quickly. I know some of you may have multiple topics you're kind of prioritizing, but if that's the case, just select maybe your top priority.
And I think, what we're trying to get at with this question is, as we said before, right, this isn't something that is necessarily reasonable to just do everything at once, right, where everything is the priority and we're going to modernize our entire code and rehaul the whole thing. But rather, right, picking and choosing what you can do and what is most important in the short term versus what are the things that are going to be longer term priorities. I think we're curious to see, either based on some examples today that you're like, oh, interesting, we should figure that out, or things that you already know that you are interested in figuring out. We're just curious what's kind of top of mind.
Awesome. Thanks to those who answered. I think the OMF team will be excited to see the volume of folks that are collecting data and working on digitizing their curb. That's great. And yeah, some of these pricing and updating curb regulations for time limits and users maybe aren't like top priority in this coming year, but again, important to sort of be empowered and prepared to understand what you are sort of legally authorized to do and not do on some of these other topics as well. And I'll just flag that, Brian, we know your hand is raised, and I think the OMF team is working on unmuting you. Oh, I think we may have done it.
Right.
And in the meantime, I'll encourage everyone to start getting your questions into the Q&A because we're going to move to that portion of things shortly.
I will say that there's a few of us signed on under the same Zoom link, and I have a feeling Mary Catherine wanted to make a comment, but she might not be able to. So apologies for that.
Okay.
Well, even if it's a comment, Mary Catherine or anyone from the Seattle team, feel free to throw it in the Q&A. Apologies, it's a little wonky, but we should be able to see it there, and I can at least vocalize it if we're not able to get you off mute. Thanks, Brian. Sorry to put you on the spot. We can go to the final slide though, and then move into any questions. We're going to share, this presentation out. We can share the deck out after. So this is really just a one slide step to pull it all together. But just in summary of what we talked about today, really encourage folks to be reviewing and sort of inventorying their city's municipal code, as well as other sort of rules, regulations, or applicable like formal policies. And as you're doing that, just making note of proposed changes or new language or other amendments that you might need, or missing language. And then would also encourage folks, I mean, I know how realistic this is kind of varies based on the size of your city and maybe where you sit within your organization, but think about brainstorming with your manager or legislative affairs lead or a city attorney, like in earlier stages, like before the ask is being made. Because sometimes if you're trying to do something now, there's like urgency around it. Folks are more like likely to just say, no, we can't do it, or we're not sure, we can't like give the approval to do that. And by sort of socializing these issues earlier on, it sometimes makes it more palatable. It's been in the heads of these folks. And you are coming maybe with with a more solution oriented like approach. And so I just encourage like the earlier these conversations are had, the better. That said, I know there's sometimes a reluctance to like pointing out why you might not be able to do something, but I think ultimately it's generally more efficient to clean up code and to have clarity in how you're moving forward to not hit some of those unexpected delays and obstacles. And with that, I think we can move into Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both so much. Em dropped the link for the resource paper in the chat so you all can download it and dive in. But yeah, we'll move into Q&A. I'm going to pick out some things, but yeah, I think what Mary Catherine wanted to emphasize here, let me say, oh yeah, hold on, I'm looking for it. Yeah, it's also good to be friends with your law department and meet the ones that are good at being flexible and progressive, which can help get past no. I think while we're kind of allowing for folks to ask more questions, do you guys have any other like success stories that you can share in terms of actually, getting it done, getting the code changed when that is the right path forward? Any advice,
And I know
Sarah or Aaron?
Oh yeah, sorry. I thought you were asking the Q&A. Yeah, I mean, I think it's something we've talked about with the Curb Collaborative cities a lot. It's a little bit, and what Mary Catherine's alluding to, it's a little bit about this change management and honestly just like interpersonal relationships a little bit. I think one, I would recommend folks go check out a document around stakeholder engagement that the OMF has put out through the Curb Collaborative, through this effort that really starts to pair like stakeholder or decision maker, what do they care about? What motivates them? What drives them? And that helps you to craft your message to understand, like, how do I make the case here, a compelling case for them to prioritize this or to advance, this like legislative proposal, because obviously cities and even agencies are just like juggling so many things, and you have to prioritize requests to city council, the bills and ordinances that are being worked on. And so just understanding like what that compelling message is and tying that back to certain stakeholders is helpful. And I also think just like doubling down on what Mary Catherine said, like engaging early and sort of developing a personal relationship with folks that are going to be helping you to interpret legal provisions potentially, or that you'll need buy-in. So that often is like the city attorneys, but could be others in your organization. But when you give people ownership or a little excitement and like describe why we're doing this, this is what we're trying to accomplish, you might get no first, but it gives you more time to like have that conversation, come with solutions to the table. And I think it also gives them a little bit ownership, a little bit more ownership, when hopefully the code amendment is eventually passed, they can sort of celebrate with you. Like, don't forget to go back and celebrate with the people that helped you along the way or that you worked with along the way. It feels like a little cheesy, but it really is helpful. And so, yeah, I'd say like compelling message, interpersonal relationship. Don't just always be coming to your law department with like, we need to do this now. It needs to be like a little bit more of a conversation. And again, I think they always appreciate you coming sort of with proposed solutions.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to answer another, or at least I'm going to give a very brief answer to what could be a kind of longer conversation in the chat. Leslie's asking, has anyone created a functional process for storing regulatory history of curbs? How do you access it, etc.? I just want to also kind of plug the role of the curb data specification in the projects of the Smart Curb Collaborative, but then also, that cities around the world are using. It provides this mechanism for kind of digitally communicating your curb rules and regulations. So it does have this kind of standard mechanism for conveying curb regulations. And then also the same for storing information and collecting information about what's happening at the curb, so events. And then there's a kind of metrics layer. So I'm gonna put just like our basic about CDS in the chat, but we have a ton of resources that kind of dive into the role of a data standard in kind of in standardizing the way that curb regulations are communicated, stored, as well as curb events. Which also leads me into this other question from Byrne about robo-taxis. So I'm going to like slightly modify this question to be more focused on the policy aspects. So have you come across cities that are starting to think about robo-taxi pickup drop off when it comes to curb policies? Any kind of nascent challenges with city policy there?
I mean, I think I don't know as it relates to like code provision. So, hi Bern, it's good to see your name at least, even though I can't see your face. Feel free to elaborate a little bit more if you want. I mean, I know cities like San Francisco are really looking to like leverage CDS for a variety of reasons, but one of which is like to be able to communicate curb management policies and to collect like data from robotaxi companies on use of the curb. A lot of the questions and like frustrations, from my understanding, around robotaxis are just like compliance concerns. Like, one, they're not being like curb space available. but maybe like many human-driven vehicles, like stopping and double parking or standing in the travel lane. And so maybe a little bit more around compliance, but I would say like the curb policies and rules should generally apply to human-driven vehicles and robo-taxis in the same way. And so you're kind of drafting code for all vehicles. But would love to hear from cities if there's any carve-outs starting to happen within code that are specific to robo-taxis as it relates to curb access.
Yeah, just a couple more comments here in the Q&A regarding that, like, highlighting the kind of real-time orchestration of that issue. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and then recognition in some areas of the city that more passenger loading zones are needed. Yeah, I think I'll also say, I think this is just an area of a lot of like ambiguity, because it is a new technology, and that there's often that kind of like silence around new technologies.
This also, just to add on, right? I think what Erin was talking about related to, I forget what you were talking, violations of, oftentimes certain things are regulated, and in the case of robo-taxis, a lot of things are regulated at the state level. But figuring out what are the swim lanes of the city, right? And so the real-time data sharing, the thinking about operationally how robo-taxi companies operate around the city. It's a challenge, right, to kind of balance city regulation and state regulation. So it's just another fun dynamic to add. Maybe we have time for like one more. I'm just looking at the time, Angela.
Yeah. Some of these are just more like discussion prompts in here. So, talking about like, we'll talk about Sunday parking and examples of old or outdated code that people are facing. Yeah, curious to kind of share those and know if there's an opportunity, if you all would like space to kind of vent and problem solve a little bit more on this. It's definitely an ongoing issue. But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and I'll wrap it up for now. But thank you so much to Erin and Sarah for presenting this work. Yeah, everyone, you now have access to the guide, and we will, of course, like be picking up this and several other curb related conversations in the months ahead, especially as the Smart Curb Collaborative Cities really start to kind of close out their 18-month project periods and continue to have learnings to share with everyone. Really, like, our role in this is to not only help these 10 cities be successful, but also to share what they're learning with other cities, around the world, to really elevate the state of practice. So thank you to everyone for joining us. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you at another webinar, or consider joining one of our CDS working group meetings to dive a little bit deeper into some of the topics specifically around data standards, and the role of kind of curb digitization. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks,